Hello dear students, today we are going to discuss a very important topic, that is theory of masses, which is in elite theory by Ortega Gasset. The lecture will try to analyze Ortega's conception of majority minority. It will also try to focus his view on aristocracy. We will also try to focus on his theory of masses. Ortega has an aristocratic or minoritarian view of political affairs. Our thesis is that Ortega's conception of masses and minorities is grounded upon a subtle distinction between the masses as a sociological phenomena, meaning the existence of the masses as a particular social group with certain clearly defined characteristics, and mass man as a psychological phenomenon, a type of character more akin perhaps to Resman's other directed men than to a member of any particular social grouping. The former view he develops mostly in Espaphia Invertebratia. Espaphia Invertebratia contains Ortega's reflection about the sickness which seemed to him to have overcome Spain after it has lost its past grandeur. He was particularly incensed by the assertion that the ills of Spain were due to the fact that there were no longer any man of stature capable of guiding the country's destiny. The statement that the men are lacking was an expression of disillusionment with the country's future, which Ortega sought to refute. It's not, he argued, that the men are lacking, but that the people, the public, the crowd, the masses, all of which terms Ortega uses synonymously, have become hermetic and no longer follow their natural leaders. The absence of men deplored in the phrase cited is nothing but a collective myth created by the masses themselves. For in certain epochs, the popular soul becomes atrophied and loses the power of creating social myths. When this happens, it is a clear sign of descendants. For when a nation is in the ascendant, the masses have the capacity to find their symbol in certain chosen people on whom it pours out the vast store of its vital enthusiasm. Only when a nation is on the decline due to the masses refuse to be masses and turn against all those who are outstanding. From this account, we may gather that the chosen people are the ones that are outstanding and are in turn the men who lead, while all those who are not so chosen compose the masses. The question may be raised as to whether such men are outstanding because of their excellence, regardless of its recognition by the mass, or whether their excellence is the result of certain qualities which the mass particularly values. This question seems to be answered by Ortega in the form of the later proposition. For he writes, a man is effective in society as a whole, not so much because of his individual qualities as because of the social energies which have been deposited in him by the masses. Unless this division between a minority of chosen people and the majority of mass of men exists, there can be no society or nation to speak of. Thus Ortega writes, and I quote, a nation is an organized human mass, given structure by a minority of selected individuals. Whatever our political creed, we must recognize this truth. It belongs to a stratum of historical reality, much deeper than concerned merely with political problems. the legal form of which a nation may adopt can be as democratic or even as communistic as you choose, but its living and extra-legal constitution will always consist in the dynamic influence of a minority acting on a mass. This is a natural law and as important in the biology of social bodies as the law of densities in physics. This law of social physics, akin to Mitchell's iron law of oligarchy, rules out the possibility of pure democratic government. This division of mankind into minority capable of leadership and a majority whose mission it is to follow provides the structural principle for the existence of a society. These superior individuals are the ones called upon to guide the otherwise misguided masses. And if they desert their posts, they are properly held responsible for the descendants of the body politic which ensure to follow. The primary social fact is the organization of a human heap in leaders and led. This supposes in some a certain capacity to lead, in others a certain capacity to be led. If, however, by one reason or the other the masses become hermetic or the minority refuse to lead, then the result is chaos. Where there is not a minority acting over a collective mass and a mass that knows how to accept the influx of a minority, there is no society, or very nearly so. Our inquiry up to now has indicated that Ortega thought that the division of a society into minorities and majorities or masses, term which he tends to equate, was a fact too evident to require additional proof. Stated as the proposition that in every society there is a division between leaders and followers. The assertion is as old as Aristotle's definition of an association. But what Ortega seems to be saying is that those who constitute the minority are in fact better qualified to rule than the components of the majority, though he never states explicitly that those who get on the top are always the best. This position is the almost inevitable consequence of his own aristocratic view of society. There is not in his view, however, any notion as to the different kinds of ruling classes which may emerge as a result of the hierarchy of values in a particular society, as was the case with Mosca. For example, the whole problem of decline helps to bring this into focus. The period of descendants, Ortega writes, are those in which the directing minority of the people, the aristocracy, has lost its excellent qualities, precisely those which caused its elevation. Now, Ortega seems to believe that it is the aristocracy's fault if the mass rebels against, for he adds, the mass justifiably rebels against this corrupt and inefficient aristocracy. But it tends to mistake its objections to that aristocracy and instead of substituting for it a more virtuous one, it tends to resent or rebuff any aristocratic virtue. When the mass believes that it can do without an aristocracy, the nation inevitably declines, and finally failure itself and the disorganization that ensues create a desperate situation. The masses then regain their humility as a result of their disillusionment with anti-aristocratic theories, and a new aristocracy emerges. This cycle repeats itself throughout history. Ortega identifies the directing minority of the people with the aristocracy. Rule by an aristocracy is the rule of the best, but the best in what respect? Now, Ortega answers is that all societies are composed of a directing minority and a mass, and those who exercise leadership in that society are the best. Not only because they manage to get to the top, but also because they possess the qualities most highly esteemed among the members of the population. Secondly, Ortega asserts that in periods of dissidence, the aristocracy lose the very qualities of excellence which caused its elevation. This may have one of two results: either the replacement of the old aristocracy by a new one representing the new values of the masses, or the degeneration of the old aristocracy with the values of the masses remaining constant. Be this as it may, once a country starts to a decline, only an aristocracy can save it. Popular confusion regarding the aristocratic nature of society stems in Ortega's view from a desire to see society as it ought to be rather than as it actually is. This tendency results in a completely sterile discussion. He argues because the matter has been solved from the first day of human history. A society without an aristocracy, without an egregious minority, is not a society. But the masses should never be confused with the lower class, which is to say, with the plebs, and neither should the aristocracy be confused with the classes most highly elevated socially. This distortion has been caused by the exposition of a crude sociology which has propagated an enormous fallacy. In every group that does not suffer from grave anomalies, there is always a vulgar mass and an outstanding minority. Clearly, within a healthy society, the superior classes, if they are really so, will be able to count with a more numerous and select minority than in the inferior classes. But this does not mean that there are no masses in the former. Precisely what conveys social dissidence is that the exalted class have degenerated altogether and become a part of the vulgar mass. The division between masses and minorities does not follow class lines. Yet the higher classes generally have a larger share of excellent men than the lower, according to our author. But within a social class, there exists a division of egregious and vulgar men, and we must be careful not to limit our concept of masses to the laboring class. This was a point that Ortega repeatedly emphasized. The relationship between egregious minorities and vulgar masses was for Ortega the basic fact of all societies and the agent of evolution. In seeking for a clear intuition of the relation between both, he gave as an example a simple social event, conversation. If we watch conversation closely, he said, we will see that all attention becomes centered on the man who is so clearly superior to the rest that they cannot feel comfortable while having differences of opinion with him. This feeling of attraction for excellent men is something that everyone is subject to at one time or another. When we find another man that is better or that does something better than us, if we are enjoying a normal sensibility, we will desire to be really and not fictiously like him and to do the things as he does them. One is reminded immediately in this context of Beggart's conception of imitation as the maker of national character. This theory of leadership is based upon the view that there is something in the exemplary man which radiates from him and which is immediately perceived by his docile followers. The very term docility implies a certain playability in the form of wishes of the exemplary few. This relation holds of course as long as the docile individual possesses a normal sensibility. Thus, anyone who lacks the capacity or is unwilling to follow the example of these few men must be considered as of an abnormal sensibility. He has become hermetic. Gasset Ortega says that there are certain norms or exemplary modes of living and being in every society, and these norms were originally exemplary actions of some individual. Neither force nor utility brought men together into permanent groupings, but the power of attraction, which the one most perfect in each case individually enjoys over the individuals of our own species. The exemplary man has a power of attraction which automatically brings him a docile following. There are some men that seem to be endowed with this gift of grace, this charisma, as Weber called it. The creation of countries was really the creation of a few, or perhaps of only one outstanding man. These men were not made models because they were influential during their lifetime, but on the contrary, they were influential socializing agents because they were models. This is the closet that Ortega comes to Gasset's conception of the model, even though he denies that his theory is based upon imitation of Gasset's. In the mechanism of exemplarity, docility, we find the roots of the aristocratic nature of every society. This is the true aristocracy, not the hereditary one. There is not has been ever any other aristocracy than the one found on the power of psychical attraction, a sort of law of spiritual gravitation which drags the docile in search of a model. Here are also the foundation of the rule-obedience relationship. For obedience presupposes docility, and the right to command is an adjunct of exemplarity. Society is ultimately but the dynamic spiritual unity formed by an exemplary and those who are docile. This interaction between an exemplar and his docile comes about because every human race that has not degenerated produced in proportion to the total figure of its members a certain number of eminent individuals in which the intellectual, moral, and vital capacities are shown with maximum potential. Evidently, Ortega assumed that nature makes nothing in vain, for he thought that either these exegeous men are forthcoming or that society would disintegrate as a result. If these exemplary men that constitute the aristocracy or ruling minority, the dociles on the other hand are the masses in the Ortega scheme. This relation between aristocracy and mass he conceived as prior to all ethical and juridical formalities and hence as constituting the very root of the social fact. The relation between the aristocracy and the masses are also provided a method of historical interpretation. The first thing that the historian should do in order to define the character of a nation or an epoch is to fix the peculiar equation of the development within her of the relationship between its masses and the select minorities. The formula which he discovers will be the surest code with which to come upon the most recondite palpitations of that historical body. On the basis of what has been said, it is sometimes rather difficult to determine what it is exactly that Ortega means by the masses. He used the term in order to describe the majority of the people or those that possess no particular qualifications, and he contrasts it with the minority which seems to possess special qualifications. The minority is the aristocracy because only a few people are capable of rising above the mass and achieving preeminence over it. The mass, on the other hand, is the multitude, a formless and amorphous heap of persons whose essential mission is to follow the minority. Thus, Ortega dichotomizes society into small minorities or aristocracy and a large mass or multitude. Minorities must lead and the masses must follow. Otherwise, the result is descendants. Above all, Ortega believed this aristocratic character of society makes democracy impossibility. For no matter what the form of government may be, society is always substantively aristocratic. There can be no escape from this social fact. As a law of nature, it inexorably takes its vengeance if we disregard it. The difference among men are of such a nature as to make equality nothing but an empty word. Rank, hierarchy, aristocracy is in the nature of things, and it has been the peculiar blindness of democratic ideology to gloss over this fact. Exemplarity and docility will be a mechanism that will function whenever men are endowed with a normal sensibility, and the social order will be an adequate reflection of this pervasive social fact. Up to now, we have joined Ortega in an analysis of mass men and the most important characteristics of this psychological type of man have emerged in the discussion. Yet the Ortega often uses the term masses to designate different men so that it will be fruitful to see the different meanings which he attaches to the term. The most common definition which Ortega gives us of mass man is that he is the average man. By this, we take it that he means any individual that has no special qualifications. He is just like everybody else. It is in this sense that he says society is always a dynamic unit of two component factors, minorities and masses. The minorities are individuals or groups of individuals that are specifically qualified. The mass is the assemblage of persons not specifically qualified. Specifically qualified in what respect? Ortega does not say. As we have mentioned before, the specifically qualified minorities would be recognized as such by the unqualified masses, so that this was really not a problem for him. Now, mass man may also be a man who is only partially qualified, of whom the best example is the scientist. The scientist knows a great deal about his own field of specialization, but with some rare exceptions, he is a barbarian outside of his field of study. The result is that he will behave in almost all other spheres of life as the unqualified mass man. It is these partially qualified men that symbolize and to a great extent constitute the actual dominion of the masses. The mass is also the vulgar, according to Ortega, and particularly the intellectually vulgar. Thus, we may extract four different connotations from Ortega's use of the word mass in the revolt. A. The average man. B. Those average men who are not specifically qualified. C. Those men who are only partially qualified. D. The vulgar. Per contra, minorities consist of those individuals who possess exactly the opposite characteristics. Hence, we may find mass men in all social classes. It would be a serious mistake to apply the term masses solely to the laboring class. What have been the factors conducive to the emergence of this type of men in public life? Ortega answers liberal democracy and technology. These two conditioning factors have contributed to the emergence of mass men, but they have also created the conditions for their own destruction. The world has grown both spatially and temporally. Its population has increased enormously, and the material and social techniques available to man today are unsurpassed in their potentialities for good or evil. The advent of the masses, Ortega wrote, is not a completely negative phenomena because it holds a great promise for the future of mankind. But this promise can only be realized if the masses decide to accept their true mission and if the minorities are willing to accept their own responsibility. Otherwise, the possibilities of a relapse into barbarism are only too evident. The treasure of Western culture will succumb before the onslaught of the vertical invasion of the barbarians. With this, we conclude today's topic. Thank you.